What would I tell my younger self if I could go back in time and meet him? I would tell him that life is both longer and shorter than he thinks. That there is in it plenty of time for all the things that people say are frivolous, but also far too little time to waste on frivolous things like petty anger and depression and hateful thoughts. I would tell him that he is far more right about some things than he thinks, and that he'll change far less than he imagines. I would remind him that he doesn't need to change to conform to the expectations of others. I would tell him to stay out of debt, and remind him that it is better to be free with nothing than it is to be under the influence of an evil or controlling master. I would tell him not to be so obsessed with the idea of status and career, because things of imagination and inspiration will have importance long after things which bring in a paycheck for profit become distant memory. I would remind him to be kind and patient with everyone. And I would tell him also to keep a distance from people who don't share his values. It is far easier not to compromise when you haven't already compromised your principles. I would tell him that saying no is usually not so risky as people who want you to say yes might lead you to believe. I would tell him to cherish moments spent with friends and loved ones, because goodbyes are seldom announced. You'll think you're going to see someone again and again, until you look back years later and realize you probably never will see them again. And you'll realize that the last time you saw them seemed just like another ordinary day. Appreciate ordinary days, because a good life is filled with them, and we're just a few ordinary days away from the end. I would tell him that patience probably won't cost you as much as you fear it might, and that doing nothing often gives you a better yield than you might suspect. The best things in life tend to come when you're not looking for them, and your greatest efforts in hindsight are seldom responsible for the defining elements of your life. Life is like a merry-go-round, in which you cannot really control its motion, only if and when you get on and off. I would tell him that there are certain moments in life which feel very dark and hopeless, and where there is no cause for faith, times when courage feels impossible. And I would remind him that courage is the choice to act courageously when you don't feel courageous. That faith is not seeing light come down from heaven, but rather the simple act of being faithful when it's difficult. And I would tell him that when you do not feel hope, you can always create it for others. And quite often, that just means having an outwardly good attitude, when inside, you're flying blind. I would tell him that everyone is right enough to be respected, and wrong enough not to be followed blindly. I would encourage him to have as much as possible a neutral position, and remind him that there are many times in life when the wisest thing you can do is to say nothing. I would tell him that when it's hard to find courage to speak, you probably ought to. And when you're tempted to say something, it probably would be best that you didn't. I would tell him that many of the things he is uncertain about, I'll never really be too sure about either, and that's okay. because life isn't a pass or fail proposition, and you don't have to have all the answers. I would tell him to take just a little bit from everyone worthy of admiration, and try to make the best parts of them traits that he has too. Finally, I would tell him that he's not really so far off point as he might fear, and that no matter how much you suspect you might not be qualified to govern the life you've been given, you're more qualified than you think, and no one else is more qualified than you to make decisions about your life. I would tell him to put his money into good dividend-bearing stocks and have patience with them, even if sometimes they go down. And I would tell him grinding in a video game will probably give him far less harm than grinding for a boss. Finally, I would tell him that despite a lot of things he needs to work on, I can't think of anyone else who I would rather be. And maybe that's the conclusion. I do love myself, because if I wasn't myself and I could somehow travel back in time to see myself as I was 15 years ago, I wouldn't really have any objections. Sure, I would know that regardless of anything I told him, those lessons I would learn, he would have to learn from his own experience. And I would go on knowing that nothing I told him would really alter his course. But maybe by having that experience, I would return to my present somehow transformed and just a little bit more objective. Perhaps I would be more inclined to be the person I ought to be today if I had a higher opinion of the journey which I've already had. And if that's true for me, maybe it's true for everyone. Perhaps we would all do well to take a moment and be thankful for the lives which we have been given by previous versions of ourselves. Thank you for watching.